Good evening, everybody. You can finish your desserts and whatever else you're eating right now. First, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to personally thank Marcel for all the work he's put into this. You know, Ken and I are the only people in the department in our early 70s, and it's really nice to see all these old guys around. So welcome. And I do want to adapt to the local context. I was supposed to talk for about 20 minutes, but given the example that everybody set today, I thought that I would talk for about 2 hours because it's quite an interesting history that the department has. Okay, I put this department history together, and I am not a historian. And I can tell you, trying to do this, from original sources, and there have been many wonderful histories of Carnegie Mellon written, and the psych department is in every one of them. And then there's Herb's autobiography, which is also a wonderful read. I really appreciate the scholarship that goes into real history. So what you're getting is history from an amateur historian. Okay, and I have a few caveats and perspectives here. Because I'm not a historian, I'm kind of an embedded journalist. Maybe that's the way to see what I'm doing here. I've been here for a long time, and I've seen a lot of the things happening, but I've also tried to understand the history that went before me. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll get into the department. I was an electrical engineer. In '62, I entered GSA along the same time that Raul entered, came to CMU. I was in the business school there, but I wanted to work with Herb Simon. I actually did a dissertation on multidimensional decision making. Herb was my advisor, got my PhD in '67, went off for Chicago for a couple of years. Talk louder, my wife says. Okay. She doesn't like that when I talk loudly at home, though. I don't know. And I moved over to psychology in '73. Okay, enough preliminary stuff. Let's get started now. This all started in 1900, actually, with steel in Pittsburgh, the canonical, picture of Pittsburgh with steel mills all over the place. And Andrew Carnegie, who at the time was the richest man in the world, or one of them, he donated $1 million, worth about $30 million today. Bob Sigler can check my inflation rate, I think I got it right, to establish the Carnegie Technical Schools, which soon became Carnegie Institute of Technology. Let's move ahead 6 years to the actual formation of this department. 100 years ago, 1906, Arthur Hammerschlag was the first president of Carnegie Tech, hires Walter Van Dyke Bingham as the director of a new division of applied psychology. Bingham had quite an intellectual genealogy and quite an intellectual influence. He was trained by Edward Thorndike, which I assume you all have heard of Edward Thorndike since you're all psychologists. And Thorndike was actually trained by Cattell and William James, so it's really pretty close to the origins. It's like an origin theory here. Van Dyke hired Thurstone. Thurstone actually was one of the chairs of the Carnegie Tech Psych Department. And he also hired Edward Strong, who was here for a few years, a strong vocational interest blank. I think most of you know about that. At the same time that department was being founded, in 1906, way off in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, June 15th, 1906 to be precise, Herbert A. Simon was born. I don't think that's a baby picture, because they didn't have color photography then. And a few months later, this is speculation on my part, but who knows, a few months later, we might have had Herb, he probably started early. You can't get that smart quickly. You have to keep working at it. So let's go back to Pittsburgh and Carnegie Tech and the newly minted division of applied psychology. We'll go from Milwaukee back to Pittsburgh. Bingham and his colleagues early in Carnegie Tech's history developed and were actually brought in to figure out ways to do what they call mental testing of the students who were coming here. And he developed a set of tests to assess their intelligence, their language ability, so on, manual dexterity, spatial abilities, because the people who ran Carnegie Tech realized that understanding the attributes and the abilities of the students would allow them to make better assignments to different areas. All of these areas were represented at Carnegie Tech very early, not just engineering, but architecture, costume design, sheet metal work, pattern making. All of these things were part of the very original Carnegie Tech, and Bingham and his colleagues developed tests to assess the best kind of placements and admissions that you could do. The program was actually housed in something called the Bureau of Mental Tests, and the vision was to identify these traits and abilities. This work that Bingham and his colleagues did was eventually noticed by the Army. This is right around the time of World War I, and they developed something eventually turned out to be called the Army Alpha, which is an ability test, a personality test in a way, really mental test designed for mass group testing, and millions of servicemen and women took that test that was developed here in this location. So the interesting part was that the early part of the department's history, given Herb's intellectual background, was very much a thrust based on organizational and management sciences and aptitude testing, very much a kind of GSA kind of thing. After Bingham and Thurstone were heads, the dark years descended upon us. The Division of Applied Psychology was terminated in 1924. Some of the faculty moved down to University of Pittsburgh, but a new department of psychology and education was formed within the new division of humanities and social sciences. There was no graduate program at this point. It was only undergraduates. What's so interesting to me about this, given that Sharon Carver and I now direct this program, interdisciplinary program in educational research, was that the department was actually doing educational research way back during those, what I've called the dark years, because there was no graduate program. The new head of that program was Max Schoen. He continued. Some of you have seen this picture in the department head's office. Is it still there? I haven't looked lately. No? Okay. I wonder what happened to it. It was painted by a very famous Pittsburgh artist, and he didn't look too happy about his job, but that's the portrait that hung in the department head's office for a long time. He continues until 1947. That's a long time to be a department head, but that's what he did. Schoen was replaced by von Haller-Gilmer. We've heard a little bit about him today. And Gilmer headed the department from 47 to 62, another extraordinarily long time to head a department. Gilmer started the graduate program that we now consider the graduate program at Carnegie Mellon. And what was so interesting about it, given what happened subsequently with Herb Simon, and I'll get to that, was that the focus was on industrial psychology with a very strong focus on quantitative and experimental emphasis. So it wasn't so different from the kinds of things that were going on in GSA, but by then Herb had changed his interests quite a bit. Okay, the Simon era. Heard a lot about Herb today, and for good reason. In 1948, Simon completes his PhD in Chicago. His degree was in political science. A lot of people don't know that. He was a political, just shows the incredible breadth of his mind and the complete irreverence toward boundaries, intellectual boundaries, traditional boundaries. So he's got his PhD in political science. He was interested in what became organization theory, which he also made the seminal contributions. He came to GSA, was a new business school that had just been formed. Now it's called Tepper. And he joined the faculty in 1949. And he started to do the work that he did. He went from organization theory to more thinking about how do individuals think in organizations, to more what's going on in people's minds, to how can we represent and express theories of complex cognitive activities. And he became increasingly interested in modeling human thought, and he wanted to think about it in terms of symbol manipulation rather than mathematical equations. He recognized the potential of using computers, and he teamed up with Al Newell and Cliff Shaw. They were out at RAND in the summers, and that's where he met Al Newell. They were doing these big complex simulations. They developed this language called IPL, eventually IPL5. We saw a little listing today of IPL5 from someone who actually suffered through a dissertation written in IPL5. And he continued to work with Newell, but he was still based in GSA. Here's a little code from IPL5. All that really matters here is, is that working? All that really matters here is this stuff. All the rest is comments so the programmer can know what he's doing. These are the actual instructions, and they're pretty primitive. There's something like move the symbol to the top of a stack, take the symbol out, test whether the symbol equals some other symbol. This was the language in which all of the early cognitive simulations at Carnegie Mellon were written. But Herb was still based over in GSIA, graduate, the business school. By 62, Herb, again applying his consummate knowledge of organization theory to his own situation, realized that he needed a better organizational base. And what he says in his autobiography, I'll read it to you here, he begins to doubt that we could accomplish the revolution from the foreign territory of GSA without a firm base in the psychology department. I resolved to do something about it. My method was abrupt, was justified in my mind by the importance I attached to the goal. And several of you today, including Ken Katowski, have talked about how you didn't mess with Herb Simon. And if Herb Simon wanted to mess with you, you had no choice. And so he decided he needed to move into the psychology department and to get the people in the psychology department to do the kind of stuff that he wanted to see done. 62, Herb convinced the top administration that psychology needs to move in those directions. Herbert von Gilmer is replaced as the department head. The new head is Bert Green. Bert Green was an AI researcher from MIT. He wrote a program called Baseball, and it was a cutting edge kind of thing. It seems so simple today, but he would load it up with a bunch of facts about baseball, and then you could ask it a question. You could say, how many games did the Yankees win in November? Or, who got the highest batting average on the Dodgers in September? And you had to type these questions in on a card, of course, and put the card into the card stack and then run it through the computer. So Bert Green had already done a little bit of AI at MIT, and he became the first head to replace Heller von Gilmer. Around the same time, again, this is from Herb's autobiography, around the same time, Newell and Bert Green wrote a proposal to NIMH, and that proposal, which I think used to be called NIH 16, it funded the department's research for a very long time. For the next 20 years, that supported an awful lot of the graduate students here and the research that went on. But according to Herb, progress was agonizingly slow. This is also from his autobiography. And the question was, how could you attract the top minds in the field into this area to get them interested when you had strong competition from other universities that were starting to do this? You may have heard of some of these people, like Brunner and Minsky and Papert and George Miller, and they were doing all this stuff at other places. And Herb wanted to do it at Carnegie Mellon, but these other places had much bigger visibility than CMU did. How could he do that? Well, he had this vision, and the vision was, why don't we start an annual symposium? And what we'll do is, we'll bring in, he's a consummate organization theorist, isn't he? He says, we'll bring in some of the real big names, we'll also bring in some junior people who are starting to get interested in this stuff, and we'll show them that there's really a field here. Maybe we'll hire some of them at CMU, but let's start this cognition symposium. And so for the next couple of years, I think the department's history can be partly explained by, or understood by, what was going on at the Cognition Symposium. Let me just review who the department heads were for a while. Since the Simon takeover, Bert Green was head, 62, Garley Forehand, Lee Gregg. Now we're getting to people that some of you remember as department heads. Chuck Kiesler was head. I was head for a while. My best accomplishment was to put in a women's restroom on the third floor. Now there's a story there. There was a guy who was named Fred Rogers, not Mr. Rogers, but there was a vice president who had a lot of influence over funding named Fred Rogers. And I went to Fred and I said, we have to put a women's room in the third floor because they're starting a lot of women in the faculty, and this is ridiculous. And he said, yeah, but I looked into the numbers and it's going to cost $20,000. I said, we really have to do it. And he thought it was kind of silly. And so I wrote him a long memo, and I explained to him, since he was kind of a straight guy, I forgot I embarrassed the hell out of him. I explained to him that women have smaller bladders, women have menstrual periods, women take longer to actually disrobe and re-robe in order to use the bathroom, and that if he thought this was so trivial, the next time he had to go, why didn't he go from the 6th floor of Warner down to the men's room on the 5th floor and see what that was like? He gave up. My other two best accomplishments were to hire Sharon Carver and Ken Katowski at some point along the way, and that's another story, but I think we've done very well with them. Jay McClellan came in the middle of my headship. I took a sabbatical in the middle of my headship. That was a pretty cool thing to do. And Bobby Klatsky was ahead from 93 for about 10 years, and Mike Shire, and now Michael Tarr. And I put him in green because he's still green, right? He has to stick around a few more years to season him a little bit, but he's doing a pretty good job. Okay, how can we summarize the scientific and intellectual history during these last 50 years? Here's the problem. Our local fiction is that this department is comprised of three main areas, right? Social personality and health, cognitive and cognitive neuro, developmental with some education interests. And we even do our graduate admissions within that structure. The faculty in these three areas get together and they decide who they're going to admit to their area. But it's really a fiction because the faculty are so creative and they keep crossing boundaries, and there's so much interdisciplinary work that goes on here that somehow to call this a department that has three areas doesn't even make any sense, even though we're stuck with it for a while. Maybe someday we'll figure out a better way to do it. So remember Herb's lament, after the takeover, progress is agonizingly slow, how to attract the top people, and so on and so forth. Herb's idea was to start an annual symposium. This is another thing that we owe to Herb, the Carnegie Cognition Symposium. This was his idea. Bring in the famous, bring in the young upstarts. So I think that the history of many of the departmental research interests from 60s up to about 2010 is reasonably well represented in the Carnegie Symposium series, but it doesn't work well for a couple of things. It doesn't work well for social or health psychology, and I'm going to fix that up later on in the talk. I'll use it, but then I'll depart from it. And it doesn't really convey the impact of Jay McKellen and the PDP and the connectionist and the beginnings of cognitive neuroscience, because they weren't represented all that well in the Carnegie Symposia. So with that caveat aside, let's go down memory lane and look at what happened during the Carnegie Symposium. Here's the first one. The first few symposia were run by Ben Kleinmetz, and I've put the names here of a few people who have some visibility back in '65. The two numbers here at the top are the year of the symposium and the year that it came out. And you can see that Ben Kleinmetz ran the symposium. He actually pioneered, he was here for about 5 or 6 years. He pioneered the use of computer-based statistical methods in clinical judgment. He also ran the first few symposia. So here's his first symposium, 1965. Who among you actually went to this symposium? Anybody here go to that one? Okay, a few of the old guys, good, okay. You'll see more and more of you went to these. And you can see that they brought in some of the really big names at the time, again, to expose graduate students and to maybe bring in some younger people. He did the second symposium. He did the third symposium. Again, if you scan these names, you'll see sort of the giants in the field at the time, plus some people who weren't so well known at that time. Dick Hayes ran one of these in 1968, and Lee Gregg ran one in '69. Then we started to diversify. We heard Len Gerard this morning. Where's Len? He ran a symposium on non-human primates, and look who was here. Big names again, Harry Harlow, David Premack, and so on. Again, this theme that Herb had, and Herb played a hand in the way all of these were organized in the beginning. Bring in some of the very best people and bring in some junior people and see if we can get people interested in what's going on around here. Sylvia Farnham-Diggory was a developmental psychologist on the department for several years. She started one on information processing in children. Actually, in '68, the Children's School, which is an important resource for our department, was founded in '68 under the directorship of Ann Taylor. Now you're starting to see, well, I guess I went to this one in '71. Bill Chase ran one in '72 on visual information processing. And you see more faculty names starting to show up, people who are currently faculty. We'll get back to the Bill Chase Symposium later on. I have some interesting comments on that one toward the end of this next 2 hours. Lee Gregg ran one on knowledge and cognition. I ran one on cognition and instruction. I was interested in this topic, even though I hadn't done any research in it. I thought this would be an interesting kind of thing to get Carnegie Mellon people thinking about cognition and instruction. Most of the symposia, in fact, every single one of them, except this one, were held in Baker Hall. But when I started trying to get funding for this one, there was a guy at ONR named Joe Young. Any of you ever encountered Joe Young? He was a funder. And Joe, I said, I want to run a symposium. Can we write a budget for $2,500? And he said, no, you need to write a budget for $23,200. I said, what are you talking about, Joe? He said, I have to clear out my budget at the end of the year or else they lower it. So you have to write a proposal that'll zero out my budget. So we had the symposium in Vail, Colorado. And we brought out all these people, plus about 10 or 15 more grad students or new faculty. I think Bob Sigler was there. Weren't you there? Yeah. And Mickey was there, I think. Yes? Okay. And we had a wonderful time for about 4 days out in the mountains of Colorado. Then we had one on cognition and social behavior. There is a little bit of social psychology in the Carnegie Cognition Symposium, but not a lot, not as much as there should be. Marcel, now I'm going to start to circle the boxes of the people who are here now and the faculty who started to get involved. As we move along, you can see, as we go into the later years, more and more of our current faculty got involved in starting these symposia, running them. We have one in '78, Bob Sigler ran one, Ron Cole ran one on perception and production of fluent speech. He was in the department for a while. John Anderson ran one, Susan Fisk and Peggy Clark did one, Catherine Sophian, and Lau and Sears. Lau was a political scientist in SDS, and he just wanted to know if he could use that Carnegie Cognition Symposium venue to run a symposium. We said, go ahead. But most of these names, except for a couple, you probably won't recognize because this was very, very much on political science. Okay, now we'll go a little faster here. And I started to put boxes around the names of the people who are still at CMU as we move along in the year. So Brian McWhinney, I ran one with Ken, talked about that a little earlier, Lynn. Tom Mitchell was over in computer science. Brian McWhinney. Bob Sigler ran one with Jay. Jay is not here anymore. Sharon and I ran another one, which was a retrospective on what had happened in the past 25 years. Sharon was hired as the director of the children's school in 1993. And we also have a program called Peer Program and Educational, I don't know what it's called. The Peer Program was a training grant, an interdisciplinary training grant that cuts through psychology, statistics, computer science, HCI, the Tepper School, the Heinz School, anything interested in education. So it's an interesting interdisciplinary example. And then Marlene was involved in a symposium in 2000. The final 5 years really reveal some of the diversity at CMU. David Rackison ran a symposium with Lisa Gershkov-Stowe on developmental psychology. Marcia Lovett and Pretty Shaw ran one on thinking with data. Bobby Klotsky and Brian and Marlene Berman did one on embodiment, ego space, and action. Marcel just did one with Kevin Pelfrey on autism. John Anderson, Marcel, Bob Sigler, and Jim Stazuski did one really kind of retrospective on the impact of Bill Chase's influence on the field of expertise and skill acquisition. And then Sharon and Jeff Schrager did a very nice fester for me that got published as part of the Cognition Symposium. And that's the end of the symposium. End of the symposium volumes. We've decided, although no one's picked up the ball yet, we've decided that the volumes are really a kind of archaic way to get information out. So there will be many more Carnegie symposia in the future. We probably won't do a book though, because first of all, by the time this stuff is presented at a symposium, it's often a little old, and by the time it comes out at a book, it's really old. And so we're going to use a different format. Excuse me. 35,000 copies have been sold of these symposia over the years. So again, this is a way that the word got out to the whole field. Symposium volumes don't usually sell very well. In the beginning, we would sell several thousand a year. In the last few years, it started to drop off, so we decided that this is not the best way to communicate. Okay, remember my meta comment was about the symposium device doesn't really work well for social personality health. So let me just summarize that real quickly. Turn the clock back a little bit. Let's go back to Kiesler. When Kiesler came in as department head, prior to Kiesler assuming the headship, the department had a couple of young faculty who were already here in social. Mike Shire was here, and Peggy Clark was here. She moved to Yale about, it's hard to believe, it was 11 years ago. It feels like she just left. That's really, we miss her a lot. Chuck wanted to move toward behavioral medicine, and so he brings in Sheldon Cohen. Cohen, Clark, and Shire form this core of social personality health. They bring in Vicki Helgeson in 90, Brooke Feeney in 2001. The Mind Body Center, joint with the University of Pittsburgh, starts in 2004. More recently, David Cresswell, health neuroscience, Casey Cresswell, and addiction. And there was a big demand for undergraduate courses in social psychology, broadly defined. Brought in Shante, the teaching faculty, also does research on social cognition and stereotypes to meet this incredible demand for courses in social. Okay, so can somebody give me a glass of water, please? So let's turn the clock back again to the 1970s. Thanks, Aaron. And the point I want to make here is that the CMU approach, which we all think is, it's all there is in the world. Well, it isn't all there is in the world. There's a world out there, and the CMU approach was not universally or uncritically accepted, and it's exemplified here in the what happened to the Chase volume. This symposium and this book includes some senior faculty at CMU, guys like Alan Newell and Herb Simon. It includes some junior faculty, Patricia Carpenter, Bill Chase, Marcel. I was only 4 years into the cognitive developmental area myself. Includes Herb Clark. Newell writes the discussion chapter for this symposium, and his chapter is called "You Can't Play 20 Questions with Nature and Win." And how many of you have ever read that chapter? Of course. We all consider it like just quintessential Al Newell and CMU. It was a brilliant chapter. Has over 800 citations the last time I looked. And it's a book chapter. Book chapters don't get cited that much, so for 800 for a book chapter is a big deal. A couple of years later, the Chase book is reviewed in an extensive review article by Alan Alport, Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology. And he entitles his review, "The State of Cognitive Psychology, a Critical Notice of Chase Visual Information." It goes 13 journal pages, so it's a really in-depth review. Alport's comments on one of the chapters, I won't tell you whose it is. In reading this chapter, one has a suffocating feeling of struggling with a large bag of feathers. All right, you didn't like that. Alport's comment on my chapter. I wrote a chapter based on a computational model. I was using one of Newell's first production system languages called PSG, and I was trying to account for some of the data that I had obtained in a study with Mickey Chi. Nothing else in this volume, I'm glad to say, matches the brass distortions of Klahr's opening chapter. I'm just starting out in the field, and this is what I have to read in a published journal. What kind of charade is this? One thing at least is certain, this sort of make-believe science will never accumulate. You probably said, what kind of charade is this, right? With English accent. Didn't like that one either. So at the end of his review, here's what he said. It's an uncritical or selective or frankly cavalier attitude toward experimental data, that the chapters had a pervasive atmosphere of special pleading. It's a curious provincialism in acknowledging even the existence of other approaches. The near vacuum of theoretical structure with which to interrelate different sets of experimental results. This is a great review, right? I mean, it's bad enough to get one of these in the mail, but this one's published. So he didn't like it much. But regardless of Alport's and others' doubts, if you look at this department today, I think we've continued to flourish. And what I did was look at all the different lab logos that we have just for our department, and it's really an incredible array. If you look at these, and you want to know if you want to know what's going on at Carnegie Mellon, look at all these slick little logos that people now develop for their labs, and you can see it's really quite unbelievable that a department that has about 25 faculty can field all of these activities, and the place is just thriving. So, what will the future hold for psychology at Carnegie Mellon? Well, it's in the hands of these people, the current faculty and their minds, and it's in really the entire department. This is a very big department, even though we only have about 25 faculty. It's really, every time I used to look at the budget when I was head, I would realize this is a lot of people. You can see it's the grad students and the postdocs and everything else. This picture was taken at the transition from Mike Shire's headship to Mike Tarr's headship. And of course, we have to thank a lot of other people who made this department run and who made it great, including, remember all our favorite staff? I can't list all the staff people, but I think, how many of you remember Betty Bowl? And Lou Beckstrom and Muriel, they really, and thank you for your attention.